The auction block in Charleston stood silent that morning in 1842. Among the 40 enslaved people waiting to be sold, one man caught every buyer's attention, not because of his strength, but because of his absolute stillness. When the auctioneer shouted commands, everyone moved, except him. When whips cracked the air, everyone flinched, except him. The plantation owners whispered among themselves. This one was different. This one was broken. They had no idea they were looking at the most dangerous man in South Carolina. What you're about to hear isn't just another story from history. This is about a weapon more powerful than any rebellion, and the 3 words that would bring down an empire. Stay with me. The Charleston slave market operated with mechanical precision. Bodies were inspected like livestock. Teeth checked for age. Muscles tested for labor capacity. But when the auctioneer reached the 23rd person in line, something unusual happened. The man stood approximately 6 feet tall, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance that seemed to exist beyond the physical world. When the auctioneer shouted directly into his face, there was no reaction, no flinch, no acknowledgement, nothing. "This one's deaf," the auctioneer announced to the crowd. "Mute too, from what the previous owner said. But he's strong. Good for field work where hearing doesn't matter." Thomas Whitmore, owner of Whitmore Plantation, stepped forward. He was known for buying what others considered defective: the injured, the sick, the supposedly useless. He turned them into workers through methods that made even other slaveholders uncomfortable. But there was calculation in his cruelty. Deaf and mute slaves couldn't spread information, couldn't organize, couldn't testify against their owners even if they wanted to. "How much?" Whitmore asked. The bidding was brief. Other plantation owners saw damaged goods. Whitmore saw opportunity. For $300, half the usual price, the silent man became property of Whitmore Plantation. No one asked his name. It didn't matter. On the plantation records, he was written down simply as Samuel, deaf/mute. But that wasn't his name. And he could hear every single word they said. The journey to Whitmore Plantation took 2 days by cart. 12 other newly purchased slaves sat in the wagon, speaking in hushed tones about their fates. Some had been separated from families. Others talked about escape plans they'd never attempt. Throughout the entire journey, Samuel remained motionless, his eyes seeing everything while revealing nothing. The other slaves quickly learned not to speak to him. What was the point? He couldn't hear, couldn't respond. He was effectively alone even when surrounded by others. What they didn't know was that Samuel was listening to every conversation, learning who was trustworthy, who was desperate, who was a potential informant for the overseers. In 2 days, he gathered more intelligence than most slaves learned in 2 years. When they arrived at Whitmore Plantation, the head overseer, a man named Jeremiah Cobb, assigned the new slaves to their quarters. He stopped in front of Samuel and studied him with the practiced eye of someone who had broken thousands of human beings. "Deaf one stays in the corner cabin," Cobb said to his assistant. "Alone. Can't have him not hearing the wake-up bell and making others late." Perfect, Samuel thought. Exactly what he needed. Whitmore Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of South Carolina lowland. Cotton fields stretched to the horizon. The main house sat elevated on a hill, a white monument to wealth built on suffering. Below it, the slave quarters formed neat rows of wooden cabins, each one designed to hold maximum occupants with minimum comfort. Samuel's isolated cabin measured 12 feet by 12 feet. One window, one door. No furniture except a wooden plank for sleeping. But isolation meant privacy. Privacy meant opportunity. That first night, lying on the hard floor, Samuel allowed himself to remember. Remember who he had been before. Before the performance. Before the silence. His real name was Solomon Baptiste. Born free in New York in 1815, he had been educated by Quaker abolitionists who saw potential in a young black man with an exceptional mind. He learned to read and write in English, French, and Spanish. Studied mathematics and philosophy. At 19, he was teaching other free black children in Manhattan when the unthinkable happened. Kidnappers working for Southern slave traders grabbed him off a New York street. They drugged him, forged papers claiming he was a runaway slave from Georgia, and transported him south before anyone could intervene. By the time he woke, he was in chains in a Virginia holding pen. That was when Solomon made his decision. Fighting would get him killed. Running would get him caught and tortured. But there was a third option, something no slave had ever tried before. He would become invisible by hiding in plain sight. For 6 months in that Virginia pen, Solomon practiced. He stopped reacting to sounds, trained himself not to flinch at sudden noises, learned to maintain the exact same facial expression for hours. When the traders finally believed he was genuinely deaf and mute, they sold him at discount to a North Carolina plantation. He stayed there 8 months, watched, learned, then got himself sold again, moving deeper into the system. Over 3 years and 5 plantations, Solomon perfected his performance while gathering something far more valuable than freedom for himself: information. Now, at Whitmore Plantation, the most sophisticated operation he had ever encountered, the real work would begin. Dawn arrived at Whitmore Plantation with the clang of an iron bell at 5 in the morning. Enslaved workers poured from their cabins, moving quickly to avoid punishment for tardiness. Samuel emerged last, his movements slow and uncertain, like someone navigating a world without sound. The head overseer, Jeremiah Cobb, watched with satisfaction. Deaf slaves were useful precisely because of their limitations. They couldn't hear whispered plans of resistance, couldn't be recruited into escape attempts, couldn't provide testimony even if authorities ever investigated plantation conditions, which they never did. "Field 3, Cobb shouted at Samuel, pointing aggressively toward the cotton fields. Samuel stared blankly until another enslaved man gently guided him in the right direction. Cobb nodded. Yes, this one would be easy to manage. What Cobb couldn't see was the detailed mental map Solomon was creating. The plantation's layout, guard positions, the timing of overseer patrols, the location of supply buildings. Every detail cataloged and stored. Cotton harvesting required speed and endurance. Workers moved through rows of plants, fingers flying as they picked the white bolls and stuffed them into sacks. Quotas were rigid, 100 pounds per day minimum. Failure to meet quota meant whipping. Solomon worked methodically, his hands moving at exactly average speed. Not too fast, which might make them assign him harder tasks. Not too slow, which would bring punishment. He remained precisely unremarkable. But his real work happened during water breaks. Plantation slaves developed their own communication systems. Subtle gestures, carefully chosen words that meant different things to different listeners. Solomon couldn't participate directly without breaking his cover, but he positioned himself where he could observe everything. An older woman named Ruth distributed water from a barrel at the field's edge. As each worker approached, she would make small talk, her words seemingly meaningless. But Solomon recognized the pattern. She was passing information. "My cousin in Virginia says cotton prices falling," she'd say to one worker. Translation: North Star route from Virginia currently safe. Heat's worse than last summer, to another. Translation: Increased patrols on roads. Master's brother visiting from Charleston next week, to a third. Translation: Potential opportunity during distraction of guest visit. Ruth was a hub. She collected information and distributed it through coded language that overseers heard as simple complaints about weather and gossip. Solomon watched her for 3 days before he understood the full scope of her network. On his 4th night at Whitmore Plantation, something unexpected happened. Someone knocked on Solomon's cabin door. He remained still, giving no indication he had heard. The door opened slowly. A young man named Isaac entered, barely 17, his face showing the struggle of someone who still remembered freedom in Africa. He had arrived on the same transport ship as Solomon just 6 months ago. Isaac approached cautiously, studying Solomon's face. Then he did something surprising. He began speaking in what Solomon recognized as Igbo, one of the languages from West Africa. Isaac was testing him. Solomon's face remained blank. No flicker of recognition. No response. Isaac switched to broken English. "I know you hear me. No one that careful is really deaf." Solomon's heart rate increased, but his expression didn't change. This was the most dangerous moment of his entire performance. If Isaac spread suspicion, overseers would test him with heated metal near his skin, sudden attacks designed to force involuntary reactions. Isaac knelt down to Solomon's eye level. "I won't tell. But I see you watching Ruth. You understanding the words she says. I need help." His voice cracked. "My sister. She got sold to Riverside Plantation. 3 miles from here. I need to get message to her." For 30 seconds, Solomon remained frozen. Then, very slowly, he allowed his eyes to shift and meet Isaac's directly. Isaac inhaled sharply. "I knew it." Solomon raised one finger to his lips, the universal gesture for silence. Then he pointed to his ear and shook his head. Then pointed to Isaac and nodded. Translation clear. "I cannot hear, but you can be my ears." It was a calculated risk. But Solomon needed allies. Isaac could be useful, young, strong, desperate enough to be bold but smart enough to be careful. Isaac understood immediately. "Tomorrow, water break, I tell you everything. You just keep being deaf, man." He paused. "What's your real name?" Solomon picked up a stick and scratched letters in the dirt floor. "Solomon." Isaac smiled for the first time. "I'm Isaac. From Igboland. And I think you're going to help me save my sister." After Isaac left, Solomon erased the letters and lay back on his wooden plank. The performance had expanded. Now he had to maintain his cover while secretly coordinating with at least one other person. More risk, but also more capability. This is where most stories of resistance end, with a small act of defiance that gets people killed. But Solomon wasn't planning small acts. He was building something that would take years. Something that would require patience most people couldn't imagine. Keep watching. 6 months passed. Solomon's performance never wavered. He worked his quota, showed no reaction to sounds, communicated only through basic gestures. To every overseer, every plantation owner, every visitor, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a deaf-mute field worker, valuable only for his physical labor. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Isaac became his voice and ears in situations where Solomon couldn't position himself. During Sunday gatherings when slaves were given a few hours of rest, Isaac would sit near Solomon, apparently talking to himself while actually relaying information he had gathered during the week. Ruth says the Underground Railroad got a new conductor operating near Columbia. Isaac would murmur while appearing to pray. 3 families made it to Pennsylvania last month. Route through the swamps is open again. Solomon would continue staring blankly ahead, but every word was filed away in his mental archive. Through Isaac, Solomon began to understand the full structure of Whitmore Plantations' operation. There were 240 enslaved people spread across the 3,000 acres. 57 different work assignments from cotton picking to blacksmithing to house service. Each overseer controlled a specific section and reported to Cobb, who reported to Thomas Whitmore. But the real power structure was more complex. Whitmore Plantation was just one of 3 properties owned by the Whitmore family. Thomas's brother James owned Riverside Plantation 4 miles east. Their cousin Robert owned Fairview Plantation 6 miles north. Together, the three plantations formed an interconnected system of 700 enslaved people and 9,000 acres. And that's when Solomon understood what he needed to do. Ruth was the key. After 8 months, Solomon managed to position himself near her during enough water breaks to understand her complete operation. She wasn't just passing information. She was managing a communication network that extended across all three plantations. Her nephew worked as a messenger, carrying supplies between the plantations. Her daughter worked in the main house and overheard conversations among the Whitmore family. Her husband was a blacksmith who repaired tools and learned gossip from slaves across the entire operation. Ruth synthesized all this information and distributed it through her coded language system. But she had never had anyone like Solomon. Someone with education. Someone who could think strategically beyond immediate survival. One evening, Solomon arranged for Isaac to bring Ruth to his cabin after dark. It was dangerous. Slaves found outside quarters after curfew faced severe punishment, but Ruth came anyway. The old woman had survived 40 years of slavery by knowing when to take calculated risks. She entered Solomon's cabin and studied him with eyes that had seen everything. Isaac says you're educated. Says you're planning something bigger than just helping his sister. Solomon picked up his stick and began writing in the dirt floor. Ruth could read, secretly taught by her own mother decades ago. The words formed slowly. 3 plantations. 1 system. Bring it all down. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she smiled, and it was not a gentle smile. It was the smile of someone who had waited 40 years for this exact opportunity. Tell me how, she said. Over the next 2 hours, working only by moonlight through the cabin's single window, Solomon laid out his plan by scratching words and diagrams in the dirt. The Whitmore plantation system was economically interconnected. Riverside specialized in cotton. Fairview grew food crops to feed enslaved people across all 3 properties. Whitmore proper handled cotton processing and shipment. Each plantation depended on the others. If one failed, all 3 would collapse. But you couldn't just burn fields or break equipment. That would bring immediate retaliation and probably get people killed. Instead, Solomon proposed something more sophisticated. Systematic sabotage so subtle that the Whitmore family would never realize it was happening until too late. Small delays in planting schedules. Tools that broke more frequently than they should. Cotton quality that gradually declined. Supply chain disruptions that seemed like accidents. None of it obvious enough to blame on enslaved workers, but all of it compounding over time to destroy profitability. The genius was in the coordination. With Ruth's network extending across all 3 plantations, they could synchronize the sabotage to create cascading failures. When Riverside's cotton harvest ran late, Whitmore's processing schedule would be disrupted. When Fairview's food production fell short, all 3 plantations would feel the shortage simultaneously. This will take years, Ruth said after studying the dirt diagrams. Solomon wrote, "Freedom is worth it." Ruth nodded slowly. Most people want freedom fast. Want to run. Want to fight. You want to be patient. You want to break them so slow they don't see it coming. Solomon wrote 1 more line. Then 3 words will end it. Ruth looked at him sharply. What 3 words? But Solomon erased everything and shook his head. Not yet. She didn't need to know that part yet. The ending would come. But only after years of preparation. Only after the Whitmore plantation system was weakened to the point where 3 words could shatter it completely. "I'm 60 years old," Ruth said quietly. "Been enslaved since I was 6. You telling me I might live to see this system burn?" Solomon met her eyes and nodded once. Ruth stood up, her decision made. "Then we start tomorrow. I'll bring you people. People who can keep secrets. people who can move between plantations. We build this network right, and maybe my grandchildren grow up free." After she left, Solomon lay on his wooden plank and stared at the ceiling. The performance was evolving into something larger. Something that would require maintaining absolute cover for years while orchestrating resistance across 3 plantations. Most people couldn't sustain that level of discipline. But Solomon Baptiste had learned something that slaveholders never understood. Patience was a weapon. And he was willing to wait as long as it took. 3 plantations. 700 enslaved people. 1 man pretending to be deaf. And a plan that would take 12 years to complete. This is the moment where resistance stopped being about individual freedom and became about destroying the entire system. You need to see how this ends. 2 years passed. Then 4. Then 6. To anyone watching, Solomon remained exactly the same. A deaf-mute field worker who showed up, did his work, and never caused problems. He was, in many ways, invisible. The overseers barely remembered his name. Thomas Whitmore saw him occasionally and congratulated himself on getting such a reliable worker for bargain price. But beneath the surface, the network grew. Ruth brought people slowly, carefully. Never more than 1 or 2 new members per year. Each person vetted over months before being trusted with the truth. By 1848, 6 years into Solomon's tenure at Whitmore Plantation, there were 23 people across the 3 plantations who understood the plan. They called themselves Nothing. Had no meetings. No written communication. Everything passed through Ruth's coded language system or through trusted messengers like Isaac, who had become invaluable as he matured into a thoughtful, strategic 23-year-old man. The sabotage was surgical. A blacksmith at Fairview would repair plow blades with slightly inferior welds that would break after a week instead of a month. A house servant at Riverside would, accidentally, serve Thomas's brother James spoiled food that gave him stomach illness during critical planting season. A cotton picker at Whitmore would mix in cotton from diseased plants with healthy crops, reducing overall quality without any single person being blamed. Each act was small, explainable, could have been accident or incompetence rather than deliberate sabotage. But collectively, over years, they added up to significant economic damage. Cotton yields across all 3 plantations declined 12% between 1844 and 1848. Equipment replacement costs doubled. Food supplies ran short more frequently, requiring expensive purchases from other plantations. The Whitmore family's profits shrank gradually year after year. Thomas Whitmore blamed market conditions. His brother James blamed weather patterns. Their cousin Robert blamed bad luck. None of them suspected their enslaved workforce because enslaved people were supposed to be incapable of sophisticated, coordinated resistance. That assumption was their greatest weakness. In 1849, 7 years into Solomon's performance, a crisis arrived. A cotton merchant from Charleston came to inspect Whitmore Plantation's processing facilities. He discovered evidence of quality problems: seeds not properly removed, cotton contaminated with plant debris, bales packed inconsistently. "Your cotton is selling at 15% below market rate," the merchant told Thomas Whitmore. "If quality doesn't improve, I'll have to find another supplier." Whitmore was furious. He called an emergency meeting with his brother and cousin. All 3 plantation owners gathered at Whitmore's main house to discuss the crisis. And that's when Solomon got his opportunity. House servants were required to serve meals during the meeting. Among them was Ruth's daughter Caroline, who had worked in the main house for 12 years. She was positioned in the dining room, seemingly focused on pouring wine and serving food, but actually memorizing every word spoken. The Whitmore family discussed selling one of the plantations. The money problems were worse than anyone outside the family knew. Between declining cotton prices, increased sabotage costs that they didn't recognize as sabotage, and some failed investments in railroad speculation, the family fortune was threatened. "We might have to sell Fairview," Robert said reluctantly. "It's the least profitable." And do what with the slaves? James asked. Selling 230 people all at once will flood the market and drive down prices. Thomas shook his head. We split them up. Sell them individually to different buyers. Take our time. Maximize profit. Caroline heard everything. That night, she relayed it to Ruth. Ruth brought the information to Isaac. Isaac told Solomon during the next day's water break. Solomon's expression remained blank, but internally he was calculating. If the Whitmore family started selling people individually, they would destroy families, scatter the network, end any possibility of coordinated resistance. The plan had always been to wait, to weaken the system slowly until the perfect moment for 3 words that would shatter everything. But if Fairview was sold, if people were scattered, that moment would never come. For the first time in 7 years, Solomon considered abandoning the long game. Maybe they needed to act now. Maybe patience had limits. That night, he scratched a message in the dirt floor of his cabin. Emergency meeting. Ruth. Isaac. They came after midnight. Ruth moving quietly despite her age. Isaac tense and ready. They entered Solomon's cabin and waited as he wrote his question in the dirt. Do we move now or wait? Ruth studied the words. If we move now, what's the plan? Escape? Rebellion? We lose either way. They'll hunt us down or kill us trying. Isaac shook his head. Solomon's been waiting for the right moment for 7 years. Maybe this isn't it. Maybe we trust the plan. Solomon wrote again. What if there is no later? The question hung in the air. Ruth was 67 now. She had lived her entire life enslaved. Statistically, she might not live to see freedom even if the plan succeeded. Isaac's sister had been sold away to Alabama 2 years ago. They'd lost track of her completely. How many others would be lost if they kept waiting? Ruth finally spoke. I think we trust Solomon. He's been right about everything else. If he says wait, we wait. Solomon shook his head and wrote, Not my decision. Yours. Because it wasn't his freedom alone at stake. It was 700 people across 3 plantations. Ruth's grandchildren. Isaac's future children. Generations that might grow up free or might spend their entire lives in chains depending on what happened next. Isaac looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at Isaac. 2 people representing hundreds of others who would never know this conversation was happening. Finally, Ruth said the words. We wait. We trust that you know what you're doing. And when the moment comes, you better be ready. Solomon nodded. Then he wrote one final line in the dirt. 12 years. I promise. He didn't know why 12 years specifically. But something in his strategic mind calculated that was how long it would take to weaken the system enough that 3 words could destroy it. 12 years of patience. 12 years of performance. 12 years of being invisible while orchestrating revolution. Ruth and Isaac left. Solomon lay on his wooden plank and stared at the ceiling. He had just committed himself and hundreds of others to 5 more years of slavery. 5 more years of suffering. 5 more years of waiting. It was the hardest decision he had ever made. The years crawled forward. 1850. 1851. 1852. Each year bringing new challenges, new losses, new reasons to abandon the plan and try something desperate. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act passed, making it legal for slave catchers to operate in northern states. The Underground Railroad became more dangerous. 3 families Ruth's network had helped escape were captured in Ohio and returned south. 2 of the men were tortured to death as examples. In 1851, a young man named David tried to escape from Riverside Plantation without consulting the network. He was caught 3 days later by dogs and professional trackers. Thomas Whitmore had him whipped publicly, 50 lashes, until his back was permanently scarred. Then Whitmore sold him to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, effectively a death sentence. In 1852, Ruth's husband Thomas died. Heart failure at age 71, his body worn out by decades of forced labor. Ruth mourned in silence, continuing to operate the network while grieving privately. Through all of it, Solomon maintained his performance. 10 years of being deaf. 10 years of being mute. 10 years of watching suffering he couldn't prevent while waiting for the moment when 3 words would end it all. But the sabotage continued. Equipment kept breaking. Cotton quality kept declining. Food supplies kept running short. The Whitmore family's wealth eroded year by year like a riverbank slowly collapsing into water. By 1852, tensions within the family had become visible. Thomas and James argued frequently about management decisions. Robert at Fairview Plantation stopped attending family meetings. The unified front that had made the 3 plantation systems so powerful was fracturing. And then, in early 1853, exactly 11 years after Solomon arrived at Whitmore Plantation, something unexpected happened that would accelerate everything. A federal investigator arrived from Washington. His name was Jonathan Wheeler, and he was part of a new government program investigating agricultural productivity across southern states. The Confederacy was still a decade away, but tensions between North and South were escalating. Some Northern politicians wanted data proving that slavery was economically inefficient. Wheeler's job was to gather that data. He spent 2 weeks at the Whitmore plantations, examining records, interviewing overseers, observing field operations. He was thorough, professional, and completely unaware he was documenting the results of 11 years of systematic sabotage. His report was devastating. Cotton yields across the 3 Whitmore plantations had declined 17% over 10 years. Equipment costs had tripled. Enslaved workers' productivity was measured at 72% of the regional average. The Whitmore operation was failing by every economic metric. Thomas Whitmore was humiliated. The report was supposed to be confidential, but copies leaked to other plantation owners. Suddenly, the Whitmore family was a laughingstock, wealthy owners who couldn't manage their own slaves effectively. The family held an emergency meeting in March 1853. All 3 brothers present, Thomas, James, and Robert, sat in the dining room where they had discussed selling Fairview 4 years earlier. This time, the conversation was more desperate. Caroline, Ruth's daughter, was again serving wine. Again listening to every word. "We need to sell everything," James said bluntly. "All 3 plantations. Get out while we can still get decent prices." "And do what?" Thomas asked bitterly. "Live like poor relations in Charleston?" Robert had a different idea. "We don't sell the plantations. We sell the slaves. All of them. Then we lease convict labor from the state prison system. It's cheaper, and if they don't work efficiently, we just send them back and get replacements." The room went silent. Then Thomas nodded slowly. "That could work. Get rid of everyone. Start fresh with a new system." They planned to begin sales in July, just 4 months away. 700 people would be sold individually to maximize profit. Families would be separated. Children sold away from parents. The network Solomon had spent 11 years building would be scattered across the South. Caroline heard everything. That night, she told Ruth. Ruth told Isaac. Isaac told Solomon the next day at water break. And Solomon, for the first time in 11 years, felt something close to panic. The meeting in his cabin that night included Ruth, Isaac, and 3 others: Martha from Riverside, Jacob from Fairview, and Caroline herself. 5 people who understood the full plan. 5 people who had trusted Solomon's promise that 12 years would be enough. They were 11 years in, and they were about to lose everything. Solomon wrote in the dirt, "July sale confirmed. All slaves, all plantations." The 5 of them absorbed the information in horrified silence. Finally, Jacob spoke. We move now. Tonight. We burn the fields, kill the overseers, run for the northern border. We'd never make it, Martha said quietly. They'd hunt us down and kill us all. Isaac looked at Solomon. You promised 12 years. We trusted you. What do we do now? Solomon stared at the words he had written. 11 years of patience. 11 years of performance. 11 years of watching people suffer while he waited for the perfect moment. And now that moment might never come because they had 4 months instead of the 1 year he needed. Unless. He erased the dirt and wrote new words. I need to speak. Everyone stared. Ruth was the first to understand. You mean really speak? Break your cover. Solomon nodded. Once you do that, you can never go back, she said. Everyone will know you've been faking for 11 years. They'll torture you. Probably kill you. Solomon wrote, I know. But it's the only way. The only way to what? Caroline asked. Solomon wrote 3 words. The 3 words he had been planning to say for 11 years. The 3 words that would destroy 3 plantations. When the others read them, Isaac actually laughed. Not from humor but from the sheer audacity of the plan. That's insane, Martha whispered. That would never work. Ruth studied Solomon's face. You've been planning this exact moment for 11 years. You really think 3 words can bring it all down? Solomon nodded. When? Jacob asked. Solomon wrote, July 1st. When sale begins. I speak. 3 plantations collapse. The others looked at each other. 11 years of trust. 11 years of following a plan they didn't fully understand. And now, at the breaking point, they had to decide whether to trust one more time. Ruth spoke for all of them. Then we wait. We prepare. And in July, you better be right. Because if you're wrong, we all die. Solomon erased everything and nodded once. Then he wrote a final line. Tell everyone. Be ready. July 1st. Everything changes. April and May of 1853 passed in careful preparation. The Whitmore family announced the sale publicly. A massive auction to be held July 1st on the grounds of Whitmore Plantation. 700 enslaved people from all 3 properties would be sold individually over 3 days. Slave traders from across the South began arriving early to inspect the merchandise. For most of the enslaved population, it was a death sentence for their families. Mothers would be separated from children. Husbands from wives. People who had lived together for decades would be scattered forever. But for the 23 members of Solomon's network, it was something else. Opportunity. The instructions Ruth distributed through her coded language system were simple. On July 1st, everyone should position themselves where they could witness the sale. Everyone should watch Solomon, the deaf-mute who had worked alongside them for 11 years. And everyone should be ready to move when he gave the signal. What signal? What were they supposed to do? Ruth didn't explain, and people didn't ask. 11 years had taught them to trust the plan even when they didn't understand it. Solomon spent those 2 months preparing himself mentally. For 11 years, he had been silent. Had trained every muscle in his face and body to maintain the performance of deafness. Had avoided speaking even when alone, terrified he might accidentally let his voice return at the wrong moment. Now he needed to speak. Needed to use words he hadn't spoken aloud since 1842. Needed to make sure his voice still worked after more than a decade of intentional silence. Late at night, alone in his cabin, he practiced. First just breathing exercises. Then humming quietly. Then single words whispered so softly no one outside could possibly hear. His voice was raspy from disuse, his throat muscles weak. But slowly, carefully, he rebuilt the ability to speak. The 3 words he needed to say had to be clear. Had to be loud enough for everyone to hear. had to be delivered at exactly the right moment with exactly the right impact. There would be no second chance. Isaac came to Solomon's cabin one night in mid-June. The sale list is posted. They're grouping families separately to maximize profit. My mother is in Group 1. My sister's children, the ones still here, are in Group 5. They'll sell them 3 days apart. We'll never see each other again. Solomon wrote. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, Isaac said, his voice hard. Just be right. Whatever you're planning, it better work. Because if it doesn't, I'm going to kill as many overseers as I can before they take me down. Solomon understood. 11 years of patience was about to be tested. If the plan failed, people would die. If it succeeded, they might have a chance at something unprecedented, not individual freedom, but collective liberation. After Isaac left, Solomon lay awake calculating every detail. The timing had to be perfect. The audience had to be correct. The psychological impact had to be overwhelming. 3 words would only work if delivered in exactly the right context to exactly the right people. Everything depended on July 1st. June 30th arrived. Slave traders from Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi filled the local hotels. The Whitmore family prepared the main plantation grounds, setting up a raised platform for the auction, inspection areas where buyers could examine people's teeth and bodies, and holding pens where enslaved people would wait for their turn to be sold. That night, Solomon had one final meeting with Ruth, Isaac, Caroline, Martha, and Jacob, the core 5 who understood the complete plan. Tomorrow you speak, Ruth said. After 11 years of silence, you're going to say 3 words that supposedly will destroy 3 plantations. I've trusted you this far. But I need to know, what happens after you speak? What are we supposed to do? Solomon picked up his stick and wrote the most detailed message he had ever composed. It took 20 minutes, filling the entire dirt floor with words and diagrams. When he finished, the 5 of them stood in silence, absorbing the full scope of what he had planned. Finally, Caroline spoke. That's not just destroying 3 plantations. That's destroying the entire economic system that makes slavery profitable in this region. Solomon nodded. And you really think 3 words can do that? Martha asked. Solomon wrote, words are weapons. Used right, more powerful than any rebellion. Isaac studied the dirt floor. If this works, if it really works, historians will talk about this for 200 years. If it doesn't work, Jacob said quietly, we'll all be dead before sunrise on July 2nd. Ruth looked at Solomon. 68 years old. I never thought I'd live to see this moment. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know, these 11 years of waiting were worth it. Solomon erased the floor and wrote final instructions. Tomorrow, during sale, watch me. When I speak, you move. Everyone moves. Trust the plan. The 5 of them left. Solomon lay on his wooden plank for the last time as a deaf mute. Tomorrow he would speak. Tomorrow, 11 years of performance would end. Tomorrow, 3 words would either liberate 700 people or get them all killed. He didn't sleep that night. Just rehearsed the 3 words over and over in his mind, making sure each syllable was perfect. July 1st, 1853 dawned clear and hot. By 8 in the morning, more than 300 people had gathered on the grounds of Whitmore Plantation. Slave traders, plantation owners, curious locals, and the 700 enslaved people who would be sold over the next 3 days. The auction platform stood 12 feet high, built specifically for this sale. Thomas Whitmore stood at one side, his brother James and cousin Robert beside him. The 3 men who had built an empire on the bodies of 700 people now preparing to sell those bodies for maximum profit. The head auctioneer, a professional from Charleston named Marcus Webb, opened the proceedings with practiced efficiency. Ladies and gentlemen, Welcome to the largest sale of prime agricultural workers in South Carolina history. We will begin with Group 1, 25 individuals from Whitmore Plantation proper. Enslaved people were brought forward one by one, forced to stand on the platform while Webb described their qualities like livestock. Strong back, good teeth, no history of running. Buyers shouted prices. Webb called out bids. People were sold and led away in chains. For 2 hours, the sale proceeded normally. 40 people sold. Families separated. Children crying. Mothers screaming. The ordinary horror of the slave trade playing out like it had thousands of times before across the South. Solomon stood in the crowd of unsold slaves, still maintaining his deaf-mute performance. But he was watching everything, waiting for the exact right moment. The moment when the maximum number of people would be present, when attention would be focused on the platform, when the psychological impact would be greatest. At 10:47 a.m., that moment arrived. Marcus Webb called out, "Next item, number 43. Male, approximately 38 years old, field worker, noted as deaf and mute, but strong and reliable. Opening bid $300. It was Solomon's turn. Overseers grabbed his arms and pushed him toward the platform. He moved with the same slow, uncertain gait he had maintained for 11 years. Climbed the steps. Stood on the raised platform in front of 300 people. Thomas Whitmore leaned over to Webb and said loudly, "This one's been excellent. Never any trouble. Can't hear commands, but follows gestures well. Good investment for field work." Several buyers examined Solomon from a distance. One shouted a bid. 300. Webb nodded. 300. Do I hear 325? Another buyer called out, 325. 350. Webb asked. At that moment, Solomon took a deep breath. For 11 years, 4 months, and 15 days, he had been silent. Had trained himself to show no reaction to sound, no response to speech, no indication he could hear or understand anything happening around him. Now, standing on the auction platform in front of 300 people, including the 3 Whitmore brothers who thought they owned him, Solomon spoke. His voice was clear, loud, each word carefully enunciated so everyone could hear. "I can read." The effect was instantaneous. Marcus Webb stopped mid-sentence. Thomas Whitmore's face went white. The crowd of buyers erupted in confused noise. Overseers turned to each other in shock. "What did he say?" someone shouted. "Did the deaf-mute just speak?" "He said he can read. That's impossible." Thomas Whitmore recovered first, his face turning from white to red with rage. "That's a lie. He's been deaf and mute for 11 years. Everyone knows he can't." Solomon spoke again, his voice stronger now. "I can read. I can write. I can do mathematics. I can speak English, French, and Spanish. I am educated." The crowd went completely silent. In the South in 1853, teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in most states. An educated slave was the most dangerous thing plantation owners could imagine. Education meant the ability to forge travel passes, to read abolitionist newspapers, to write letters to Northern sympathizers, to understand legal documents and contracts. An educated slave who had pretended to be deaf and mute for 11 years, who had positioned himself to hear conversations masters thought were private, who had observed without anyone knowing he was watching, was a catastrophe beyond imagination. Marcus Webb found his voice. "You've been faking? For 11 years." Solomon met his eyes. "Every single day." Thomas Whitmore climbed onto the platform, his face contorted with fury. "What did you hear? What did you learn?" And that's when Solomon smiled. Not a kind smile. A smile that promised destruction. "Everything," Solomon said quietly. "I heard everything. The crowd erupted. Plantation owners pushed forward, suddenly terrified. If one slave could fake being deaf for 11 years, how many others were faking? How many private conversations had been overheard? How many secrets learned? Thomas Whitmore grabbed Solomon by the shirt. "What did you hear? Tell me." Solomon raised his voice so everyone could hear. "I heard you discuss selling Fairview Plantation 4 years ago because you were losing money. I heard you plan this sale to cover gambling debts. I heard you admit that cotton quality declined because you bought inferior seeds from your brother-in-law to save money." James Whitmore's face went pale. "That's confidential business information." "I heard Robert at Fairview Plantation admit to James that he's been skimming profits for 3 years. I heard Thomas tell his wife that the plantations are mortgaged beyond their actual value. I heard all 3 of you discuss forging productivity records for the federal investigator." The crowd of buyers was now completely focused. This wasn't just about one educated slave. This was about the Whitmore family's complete business operation being exposed as fraudulent. A buyer from Virginia called out, "Are these plantations actually profitable or not?" Thomas Whitmore tried to recover. "He's lying. You can't trust anything a slave says." Solomon turned to face the crowd directly. "I can prove everything. For 11 years, I memorized every conversation, every number, every secret." The Whitmore plantation system is failing because of their own mismanagement, not because of market conditions or weather. They're trying to sell us to cover their debts before creditors foreclose on the properties. Another buyer shouted, "Is that true, Whitmore?" Thomas Whitmore was speechless, because it was true. All of it. The plantations were mortgaged. The family was in debt. The sale was a desperate attempt to generate cash before banks seized the properties. And now, in front of 300 potential buyers, a slave had just exposed the complete fraud. Within minutes, the auction dissolved into chaos. Buyers demanding to see financial records. Other plantation owners questioning whether their own supposedly deaf or simple-minded slaves were actually gathering intelligence. Overseers arguing with each other about who had been responsible for supervising Solomon. Thomas Whitmore stood on the platform, his empire crumbling around him. He turned to Solomon with pure hatred. "You destroyed us." Solomon met his eyes. "You destroyed yourselves. I just told the truth." As overseers moved to drag Solomon away, probably to torture him for information about what else he knew, something unexpected happened. Isaac stepped forward from the crowd of enslaved people. Then Martha. Then Jacob. Then Ruth, moving slowly with her elderly body but her voice strong. "He's not alone," Ruth called out. "There are 23 of us. We all know the secrets. We all heard the conversations. You can't torture all of us." And that's when Solomon realized his plan had worked even better than he expected. The mere possibility that 23 educated slaves had spent years gathering intelligence was more terrifying to plantation owners than any armed rebellion. Because they couldn't know which other slaves might also be faking, might also be listening, might also be waiting to expose secrets at the worst possible moment. The slave system depended on owners believing they had complete control. Solomon had just proved that control was an illusion. The sale never recovered. By noon on July 1st, most buyers had left. Word spread through Charleston by evening. The Whitmore plantations were bankrupt, their enslaved workforce had been gathering intelligence for years, and no one could trust that their own slaves weren't doing the same thing. Within a week, the Whitmore family declared bankruptcy. Banks seized all 3 plantations. The 700 enslaved people were not sold individually but kept together as the bank tried to sell the properties as complete operations. But no one would buy. The scandal had made the Whitmore plantations toxic. Any plantation owner who purchased them would be admitting they were willing to take on a workforce that had proved capable of sophisticated, long-term deception. By August 1853, the banks gave up and leased the plantations to northern agricultural companies that agreed to pay the enslaved workers small wages. Not freedom exactly, but a step toward it. By 1855, most of the 700 people had negotiated releases from bondage and moved north. Solomon Baptiste, who had pretended to be deaf and mute for 11 years, 4 months, and 15 days, walked out of Whitmore Plantation a free man on September 12, 1853. He was 38 years old. But the impact of his 3 words, "I can read," extended far beyond the Whitmore plantations. The scandal sparked panic across the South. Plantation owners suddenly questioned every slave they thought was simple or disabled. New laws were passed requiring regular intelligence testing of enslaved people, which was impossible to enforce and only increased paranoia. The abolitionist movement seized on Solomon's story. Northern newspapers ran articles about the deaf-mute who destroyed 3 plantations. Solomon himself was invited to speak at abolitionist gatherings, though he rarely accepted. He had spent 11 years performing silence. Now he preferred to let his actions speak. But he did give one interview to Frederick Douglass's newspaper The North Star in 1854. The interview was republished in dozens of papers and became one of the most widely read accounts of resistance to slavery. When asked why he had waited so long, why he hadn't escaped earlier or spoken earlier, Solomon's answer became famous. "Freedom for one man is escape. Freedom for 700 people is revolution. I wasn't interested in running. I was interested in destroying the system that made running necessary." The economic impact was measurable. Between 1853 and 1860, 11 other plantation systems in South Carolina and Georgia collapsed, partly due to the paranoia Solomon's revelation had created. Plantation owners became so obsessed with surveillance and control that their operations became unprofitable. The psychological impact was even larger. Solomon had proved that enslaved people were capable of long-term strategic thinking that matched or exceeded their owners' capabilities. This terrified slaveholders because it undermined the core ideological justification for slavery, the claim that black people were intellectually inferior. As historian Marcus Rediker would later write, Solomon Baptiste's 3 words, "I can read," did more damage to the intellectual foundation of slavery than 1,000 armed rebellions. He proved that the system's fundamental assumption was wrong. Ruth lived to see freedom. She died in 1856 at age 70, having watched her grandchildren grow up free in Philadelphia. Before she died, she gave one interview where she was asked if the 11-year wait had been worth it. "Every single day," she said, "because we didn't just escape slavery. We destroyed it. That's worth any amount of waiting." Isaac found his sister in Alabama in 1858. She had survived and eventually been freed when the plantation where she worked collapsed for reasons eerily similar to the Whitmore failure. They reunited in New York, where Isaac became a teacher and his sister a seamstress. Caroline, Martha, Jacob, and the other 19 members of the network all survived to see freedom. Some moved north. Some stayed in South Carolina and became leaders in their communities during Reconstruction. All of them carried the story of what happened when patience and strategy replaced desperation and violence. Solomon Baptiste himself lived until 1891. He worked as a teacher, a lecturer, and eventually a writer. His memoir, 11 Years of Silence, published in 1867, became one of the most important documents of the slavery era. In the memoir's final chapter, Solomon reflected on the choice he had made in 1842 to pretend to be deaf rather than fight or run. "I realized that masters feared educated slaves more than rebellious ones. A rebellion can be crushed with violence. But intelligence, strategy, patience, those cannot be defeated with whips or chains. They can only be defeated by ending the system that makes them necessary. So I became invisible. I listened. I learned. I waited. And when the moment came, I spoke 3 words that contained 11 years of gathered knowledge. 3 words that proved we were not the simple, childlike beings they claimed we were. 3 words that terrified them because it meant they had never been in control. I can read "destroyed 3 plantations" not because of what I said, but because of what it revealed. It revealed that the entire system of slavery rested on lies. Lies about our intelligence. Lies about our capabilities. Lies about their own power. And once those lies were exposed, the system could not survive. The man who pretended to be deaf and mute for 12 years, actually 11 years and 4 months, but the story became known as the 12-year silence, did something unprecedented. He turned patience into a weapon. He proved that resistance didn't require violence or martyrdom. It required strategic thinking, coordination, and the willingness to wait for exactly the right moment to act. 3 plantations collapsed because of 3 words. But those 3 words represented 11 years of careful observation, network building,